Okay, great. So welcome everyone to our Impostor Phenomenon webinar implemented by the ALBA network. The ALBA network was created for promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in brain sciences. I am Jose Peña, right? A brain researcher at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York, USA, and a member of the board of directors of the ALBA network. The foundation of the ALBA network was induced by observed inequities in academia around the globe and factors affecting various groups of underrepresented researchers, such as implicit biases and discrimination. The name of the ALBA network, right, means sunrise in several languages and implies the idea that our scientific communities are starting to acknowledge the importance of equity and diversity. That's why the name was chosen. Activities in the ALBA network include several things, like promotion of awareness and advocacy, right? By implementing a declaration of equity and inclusion, organizing webinars and panel discussions, addressing diversity across regions, advocating inclusive research environments by policymakers, funding agencies, and across institutions. Also promoting visibility and recognition, right, of success stories of underrepresented neuroscientists and institutions via highlighting these stories and establishing awards to recognize their excellent contributions, and creating databases, right, and resources containing information about scientists and underrepresentation, and also supporting mentoring and development networks by hosting workshops and events at major conferences. The ALBA Declaration on Equity and Inclusion expresses a list of concrete actions that individuals and organizations can take to promote equity and inclusion, and focuses on factors that may underlie underrepresentations in scientific communities, such as implicit biases and workplace cultures. This declaration is available at the ALBA network website and welcomes support from individuals and institutions across the world. Here are recent ALBA webinar series and network events addressing specific challenges across the world, right? Several of them, right? And posted and useful articles and links, right, that the ALBA network has done, right? Also, awards and grants to induce visibility and recognition of researchers from underrepresented groups have been implemented by the ALBA network and shown examples in this slide. Highlights of success stories from underrepresented scientists, career paths, and challenges which resulted in their becoming role models have also been done. And also career development has been supported by several ALBA events and panel discussions on equity in academia and gender issues. Fortunately, the ALBA network has several supporting and founding partners, including neuroscience and scientific research societies and foundations across the world listed in this slide. Here are some suggestions of how to get involved in actions of the ALBA network, such as signing in the ALBA Declaration on Equity and Inclusion, joining ALBA by becoming a member for free, initiating new projects and activities, right, as ALBA volunteers, right, sending the ALBA network interesting data and examples of best practices, right, just selecting potential ALBA members as speakers, right, in conferences, right, becoming a mentor of your experience, right, and following and tag the ALBA network in social media, right, as examples, right. And this is the link to join the ALBA network at the bottom of this slide, right? Work on diversity and inclusion. So, related to today's webinar, focused on imposter phenomenon in neuroscience. I must say that I was elected by members of the ALBA network based on my personal background and proposed plans. And these plans were working on gender and sexual diversity, but also on imposter phenomenon. And my motivation to work on imposter phenomenon was based on the belief that feeling inadequate, which is the basis of imposter phenomenon, is a factor that escalates underrepresentation of minority groups. Right? Several colleagues from my department of psychiatry, my institution, including the chair of this department, Jonathan Alpert, helped me start working on a potential survey to investigate imposter phenomenon. However, I'm very grateful to the ALBA network members, including founder Carmen Sandy, right, and manager Matilde Mogan, right, to help implementing a working group on imposter phenomenon by the ALBA network. And this group includes two very seriously and motivated and proactive members, right? Stamatina Tzanoulinou, right? And Natascha Diamantopoulou, right? In addition to me. Together, we have developed a survey for tentative assessment of imposter phenomenon features and potential causes, of which all attendees today probably had access ahead of this webinar. Our working group was very interested in studies, right, conducted by several teams, which will be mentioned during our webinar, and specifically one from Andrei Cimpian, right, a professor, right, of psychology at New York University. And Andrei kindly accepted to support today's webinar, providing information about his expertise on this topic. Thank you, Andrei. Right. So finally, after my introduction, right, we will have the following sessions today. Right. Next, we will hear definitions, right, of features and implications of the imposter phenomenon by Natascha Diamantopoulou. Subsequently, we will hear very interesting insights on stereotypes about intellectual ability as a source of imposter feelings among academics by Andrei Cimpian. Right. Next, we will then follow sharing personal neuroscience perspective, personal statements, right, and opening a general discussion of our survey findings by Stamatina, sorry. And finally, we will have a discussion of imposter phenomenon, suggested questions and plans proposed by all attendees of today's webinar. So towards this final goal, just everyone, please feel free to add questions to the chat while you are hearing the presentations, and then or ask questions after each presentation, well, and we will use all these questions for our final set of final discussion. So thank you very much, and my pleasure to move into Natascha's presentation now. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can see my slides.
Yes.
Thank you, Jose, for passing over. I definitely feel like an imposter talking. Oh, sorry about that. I definitely feel like an imposter talking about imposter syndrome because I'm definitely not an expert. I was just interested in this and I was happy to join this team. So a few definitions is what is the imposter phenomenon or imposter syndrome. It manifests mostly as a persistent internalized fear of being exposed as a fraud. So the individuals feel that they don't belong where they are, that they are not adequate, they're not good enough. And originally it was thought that it's an issue affecting primarily high achieving females, but later research shown that this affects both males and females equally. And in fact, some research are suggested that men are actually more likely to have a more severe anxiety compared to women about these feelings. So there are several types of imposters. You can have the burned out superhero that's working themselves to exhaustion to prove that they are good enough, or a natural genius that gets crushed by their unrealistic goals. A constantly dissatisfied expert perfectionist that nothing is ever good enough, or a disconnected soloist that doesn't want to work with others or ask for help for fear of appearing weak or incompetent. A paper by Cruz a couple of years ago and associates, they attempted to see if there is an evolutionary origin or perspective in that. So they argued that maybe it could be a vestige of a primitive arousal status that can follow and that can be manifested as anticipatory anxiety or withdrawal from a potential threat. both emanating from the core and ancient system in the brain that regulates flight, fight, or freeze responses, or could it be an evolution? Could it have an evolutionary origin that would serve a selected trait that could offer an advantage within the social hierarchy structure that has been very important for societies to keep evolving? Or it could be associated with the primary emotion of shame, which has been shown that may have an evolutionary function in keeping the tribe together. And although there hasn't been any research on the neurobiology of imposter feelings, they argue that it would be very useful to be looking at the two major systems in the brain, the stress system, for the obvious reasons, regulating anxiety and all these feelings that they just mentioned, but also the reward system with its inadequate activation to be shown that can is accompanied by concurrent dysphoria and pessimism about the future. Researchers and experts, and up until very recently, have been depicting and examining the phenomenon in the individual level of analysis. And in fact, although Clance and Imes, when they first coined the term, they described it as an imposter phenomenon. Later on, academic research and public views have taken over to calling it a syndrome, which strengthens the individual and its dysfunctional nature, and making people feel that they could be even treated as patients, and it definitely implies a medical model of dysfunction within the individual. So it has been over-individualized and pathologized, and there have been numerous workshops, and you hardly find a conference where there isn't a seminar about how can you deal with your imposter syndrome and what can you do about it? And you could be seeking for mentoring or help of experts and even appropriate psychotherapists. But is it really a trait of the individual, or is it rather a state, a behavioral state that can be elicited by the environment? And I was very interested in that to see what's out there. And in fact, as I said before, more recent research has been pointing exactly to that. And a paper by Fenstra 2 years ago showed that exactly it's the context and social structure that can create imposter feelings. And these are not solely a result of a person's dispositions or personalities, but they can work themselves from the outside in. And it's viewed that the imposter syndrome is directed towards fixing women at work instead of fixing the places where women work, but also for men, the ones that deviate from the strong assertive stereotype and they fail to conform to societal expectations, they can be facing harassment or even ostracism from the places where they work. So going into more detail of how can the specific context fueling in imposter syndrome feelings, Fenstra and associates argue that it can emanate from the societal level. So we can all see that, or I guess it's so obvious nowadays that the profile of a successful leader is a white heterosexual male. So whoever doesn't conform with this, women or anyone else are often depicted as lacking leadership qualities. And there has been, on top of it, a persistent negative stereotyping of women and ethnic minorities. And only those who possess agentic and assertive traits are the ones that are considered a good leader. So it's easy to see how women or ethnic minorities, that people from these groups that don't possess these traits, when they find themselves in these leadership positions, how can they feel like imposters? but also at the institutional levels. Again, women and ethnic minority groups are more or less likely to occupy particular professions. For example, they are underrepresented in surgery up until this day and overrepresented in nursing or in their particular roles within an organization. You see many more women in social, human resources or social services, and on the other hand, many more men in information technology and such. And they are also, and are also underrepresented in higher hierarchy positions, and maybe sometimes overrepresented in the lower ranks. And we can see this in this paper specifically for the neuroscience academia, how there's an equal distribution of men and women when it comes to who's the first author of a publication, but this quickly shifts and dominated by male, primarily being last authors, getting the awards or being invited in seminars or conferences as speakers. And lastly, at the interpersonal level, it's how people are treated by self-relevant others that really shapes their view of their self-worth and their and how do they see themselves in that profession, because these everyday interactions are filled with these social evaluative cues. So then they create these feelings of, do I belong here? Do I deserve to be here? And we can, I guess, all imagine how in traditionally white, male-dominated occupations, where female and ethnic minority employees are less often sought out for advice or included in work-related discussions, how can they have these feelings of imposterism based on these subtle everyday oversights? So you don't need necessarily to have an environment of extreme aggression or racism or sexism. It's enough that these subtle oversights that can fuel these feelings. And I would be interested to follow up in discussion with all of you about what would be the specific elements in the neuroscience field that could elicit these imposter feelings. And one could be something very much core in the nature of research due to the complexity of the brain. As the more we learn, the more questions we open, and we have failed so much in providing new insights for treatments, and so at some level might all feel like imposters. But also the persistence of gender and racial bias in high levels of hierarchy. In Columbia University, where I did my postdoc, for example, of the 52 PIs, only 10 are female and only 6 come from diverse racial background. And I remember myself being in a room full of men, and whenever I tried to make a comment, it was as if no one said anything. And also the element of brilliance, which we'll hear much more from Andrei soon, and the focus on what traditionally has been perceived to be male-dominated skills like math, physics, coding, engineering. And I will be really interested in your input at the end. With these resources that we can also post after the end of the seminar for anyone that would like to read more, I hand over to Andrei, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, I'm just going to share here. And just to quickly check that you can see my slides. Thumbs up.
Yes.
Great, thank you. So thank you very much for the invitation to share some of my research in this context. I'm really excited to be here and contribute to this webinar on such an important topic. And also thanks to Natascha for an excellent overview on the research on imposter phenomenon. You made my job a lot easier in light of the comprehensive overview that you provided. Just to tell you a little bit about myself and why I'm here, I'm a psychology professor at New York University. I study a range of topics in developmental, cognitive, and social psychology, where the focus, the kind of thread that runs through a lot of them is stereotyping and diversity in educational and professional settings, understanding how stereotypes develop and how they affect young and adult students' professional aspirations and outcomes. So like many of you, I study a very complex phenomenon at a different sort of level of analysis. And I try to break it down into simpler components. And that's what I'll try to do today as well, present some data and some arguments on a particular way of thinking about the imposter phenomenon in academia. So what I plan to do today is give you a broader overview of the research that my collaborators and I have done on the topic of diversity and inclusion in academia. And I will end with what this broader account means for the imposter phenomenon. So this means that the data on the imposter phenomenon will come up toward the end of the talk. So hold on, we will get there. But I wanted to start with essentially the punchline. If you take one thing from what I will say here today, I want you to take this away. The imposter phenomenon in academia, and I suspect elsewhere as well, is not due to individual vulnerabilities. It's not an individual pathology. It's not as if women are inherently more likely to be vulnerable to these feelings of being inadequate, of believing their success is unearned. Although this is how it's typically described, as Natascha said, especially via the use of the label syndrome, which makes it seem like something that you need to get medication for or go see a doctor for, right? This is not, from the point of view of the data that we have today, this is not how we should think about the imposter phenomenon. But rather we should think about it as being due largely to structural factors in academia. These feelings of being an imposter, of being a fraud, emerge in individuals with certain backgrounds as a function of exposure to particular contexts and environments. And what this means is that it's our responsibility, especially as more senior members of the whatever field we find ourselves in, whatever department we find ourselves in, of leaders of our lab or senior members of our lab, to create environments in which everyone can thrive and feel that they deserve to be there and that they deserve to have made it as far as they have, whether it's in a PhD program, as a young assistant professor, and so on and so forth. There are a variety of structural factors that can give rise to the imposter phenomenon in academia. My research focuses on a particular one, which is stereotypes about intellectual ability and beliefs about intellectual ability as being the key to success in academia. And I will focus on the research that we've done on this topic, again, on the understanding there are many structural factors that contribute to this phenomenon. But I, like any researcher, focuses on a particular causal pathway that I'm trying to understand, which fits into the broader context of multiple causes feeding into this phenomenon. So the strand of the research that I'll tell you about today seeks to understand why some careers and organizations reflect the diversity of our society and others not so much. And as a test case, we focused on gender differences among academic fields. And the fields that are most often talked about in this context are STEM fields. Not surprising to you, so science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. These are the data on gender composition of 2018 PhD degree holders. This is data from the NSF survey of earned doctorates. This is a comprehensive survey of PhD holders in the US. And not surprisingly, as I've illustrated for you here in this very forward-thinking pink and blue color scheme, is that women are underrepresented at the PhD level in many STEM fields, such as engineering and physics. What's interesting, though, and less often talked about, is that there is actually variability among STEM fields in terms of women's representation. In some STEM fields, for example, biology and geosciences, and I would put neuroscience to some extent to that bin as well, women have reached parity, at least at the PhD level. And what's even more interesting and even less often talked about is that, but I think potentially revealing, is that the situation in STEM is in some ways not unique. The situation in STEM actually resembles the situation in other parts of academia. So if you look at fields in the social sciences and humanities, such as philosophy or music theory and composition, you see gender gaps that sort of rival in magnitude the ones in STEM fields. but also a huge amount of variability, such as the other fields in this domain have either 50% women or more than 50% women. So given this variability, my colleagues and I proposed that taking a broader perspective that includes fields outside of STEM as well, rather than just focusing on STEM, might reveal new and powerful ways of thinking about the problem of women's underrepresentation in STEM. So we reasoned that there may be features of a field that make it unwelcoming to women, and that potentially lead to feelings of being an imposter, as we'll see a little bit later, that apply just as much, say, to engineering and physics as they do to philosophy and music theory and composition. So what might these features be? Why is it that we see women being underrepresented in fields as far-flung as physics and philosophy? Well, one possibility is suggested by the fact that our society, and by our society I mean sort of the US and Western Europe, but probably other parts of the world as far as we know, still associates high-level intellectual ability, intellectual firepower with men more than women, with boys more than girls. So this is a New York Times article from a few years back in which the author presented the results of his analysis of anonymous Google searches performed by American parents in the privacy of their homes. And he was particularly interested in how often parents search Google about the intellectual attributes of their sons and daughters versus their physical attributes. And what he found is that for every 10 searches about daughters being gifted, there were 2.5 times as many searches about sons being gifted. Again, and these are searches performed by American parents in the privacy of their home. Nobody, they don't know that anyone's going to tally their searches down the line. So this is, to some extent, a veridical record of their expectations of what they're looking for in their sons and daughters. Also important to note, parents weren't sort of picking up something true about the world. They weren't looking at their sons and detecting more intellectual ability and therefore looking into it on the internet. In fact, if you look, for example, at gifted and talent programs in the US, which have very strict IQ cutoffs, you see that actually girls are slightly more likely to be represented in these programs relative to boys. So these are expectations, these are stereotypes that American parents, but I suspect parents in other countries as well, bring to the table. Sadly, when you look at searches about physical attributes, so for example, being overweight, those searches were much more common about girls than they were about boys. So for every 10 searches about my son being overweight, for example, there are 17 searches about my girl being overweight. And again, if you look at the distribution of who is overweight, you see that actually boys are more likely to be overweight relative to girls. So these stereotypes don't really track reality. A little bit closer to higher education, we can look at, for example, how college students talk about their instructors on Rate My Professor. Rate My Professor is probably, at least those of you in the US are very familiar with, but I imagine that there's versions of this in other parts of the world as well, where college students can go on the internet and anonymously rate their instructors. In this case, on Rate My Professor, you can also enter some text data about your professor. And what Ben Schmidt, who's the researcher at NYU, did is essentially downloaded all the text data and made it searchable. So you can go to a website, I'll give you the address in a second on the next slide, and search any search term you want, any word you want, and it'll give you a breakdown of how often that search term appears in reviews of male instructors and female instructors across 25 or so fields. So what you see when you look across these 14 million reviews that essentially he had access to, is that if you search for a word like genius, for example, you see that across fields, that word occurs on average, about 3 times as often in reviews of male instructors as it does in reviews of female instructors. You see something similar when you search for brilliant, right? So again, data such as these reveal that our society views raw intellectual talent, brilliance, giftedness to be male qualities more so than female qualities. I should also say that these reviews these anonymous reviews didn't reveal sort of a blanket bias against female instructors. So if you search for superlatives like excellent or amazing, those are actually pretty evenly balanced between men and women. And of course, if you search for things that are associated with warmth and competence, like being nice, being caring, Those are more likely to occur in reviews of women instructors than men instructors because of the stereotypes that associate these traits with women. Okay, so how does this all relate back to the question of gender gaps and imposter feelings? Well, my colleagues and I proposed that this broad stereotype that associates brilliance with men more than women combines with differences among fields in the extent to which their members believe that innate intellectual ability, giftedness, brilliance is required for success. So the basic idea here is that perhaps biologists and neuroscientists and physicists and philosophers have systematically different opinions about how one becomes a successful top-level scholar in their field. And if such variability exists, then it should interact with stereotypes that associate brilliance with males in this green box here and make it such that greater gender gaps are found in disciplines that place more emphasis on raw talent. And we have turned this hypothesis the field-specific ability beliefs hypothesis, or FAB for short. Just a couple of caveats here. Obviously, as I've emphasized already, this is not the only explanation for a phenomenon as complex as gender segregation in academia, right? So a phenomenon like this is obviously multiply determined. Nevertheless, we are focusing here on what we think is an important and previously overlooked cause, one of many, that might lead women to be underrepresented in certain academic contexts. And I should also clarify then when I'm talking about brilliance, I'm not talking about a scientific concept here. Like, we're operating in the realm of people's beliefs about brilliance, right? Like, their intuitive notions about brilliance, which can be quite vague. And in fact, that's the problem, right? When you're operating with these vague notions, essentially like, I'll know it when I'll see it. That's what some people say. Then it's exactly the kind of context in which, for whatever reason, some people are going to seem more brilliant to you than others in the context of making these vague judgments. And the reason is obviously stereotypes that associate these traits with some members of some categories more than others. So it's this vague intuitive notion of brilliance that is the relevant variable in our model. A first bit of evidence for this model comes from a survey of academics from a few years back, in which we recruited members of academia, so graduate students, postdocs, faculty members across 30 different fields in STEM, social sciences, and humanities. And we asked them, among other things, like what they believe is required for success in their field. In particular, to what extent do they think the success field requires this special gift that can't be taught? And then we looked for a relationship between responses averaged to the level of each field and the representation of women among PhD recipients in that field. And what you see is a very strong negative relationship here, such that the more a field emphasizes the x-axis here, with higher values emphasizing more of an emphasis on brilliance, the more a field emphasizes brilliance, the fewer women obtain PhDs in that field. So fields like philosophy and mathematics, which actually are some of the ones that have the biggest gender gaps at the PhD level, are also the ones that seem to emphasize brilliance the most. If you're interested, neuroscience is, I hope you can see my cursor, I'm not sure if you can, but it's sort of middling here. Let's see. So we have a lot of other variables and analyses that we did in the study, and I'm happy to talk about them in the Q&A. Other variables that you might think could be predicting gender representation across fields rather than brilliance orientation per se. We did a whole bunch of things to ensure that it isn't another variable sort of masquerading as emphasis on brilliance that's predicting gender representation across fields. And I can share more about that in the Q&A if it comes up. It was important for us to also look at whether this emphasis on brilliance, this field-specific ability beliefs variable, predicts women's underrepresentation within each of these big domains, rather than when you put the two domains together, STEM and social sciences and humanities. And in fact, it did. So if you just subset the fields to only STEM fields, you see a similar negative relationship, such that the more STEM field emphasizes brilliance, the fewer women obtain PhDs in that field. And if you just look at the social sciences and humanities, you see a similar relationship, such that, again, the more a social science or humanities field emphasizes brilliance, the fewer women obtain PhDs in that field. Now, obviously, there are a lot of limitations to this study. including that we're only looking at a US context and we're only looking at PhD completion, whereas gender gaps can occur at many points in the educational and career trajectory of academics in the field. To address some of these limitations, although not all, in a separate study that's currently making its way through the review process, we actually look at ORCID, which is the author tracking software that probably all of you use to submit your papers to journals or to apply for grant applications. ORCID actually, you're able to, and many people do, fill out essentially an educational and career profile on ORCID, and the default is for these to be public. So ORCID makes these data available to researchers to, do whatever they want with them. To, in this case, understand how. What we did with them is to try to understand how women and men move across academia. And the advantage of the ORCID data is that it has academics, not just from the US, but from all over the world, and not just at the PhD career stage, not just at PhD recipients, but also essentially going from where you got your university degree to all the way to whether you're a department chair in your department, right? So it runs the gamut of career. So what we were interested in particular here, not surprisingly, is whether women and men move differentially across fields as a function of their emphasis on brilliance. So is it the case that if you look at the brilliance orientation of a field, across different career stages, women are more likely to move toward a lower emphasis on brilliance fields, and men more likely to move toward fields that emphasize brilliance to a higher extent? And what I mean by move from one field to another is, for example, if you get your PhD in neuroscience and then you're hired in a psychology department for your first job, or if you get your bachelor's degree in math and then you go get a PhD in neuroscience, those are the kinds of transitions that we're interested in here. So let me show you, this is a figure that's kind of complicated and maybe unlike anything that you've seen before, but the interpretation is quite simple once I set the stage for you. So what you're looking at here is, first, the vertical axis is the field's brilliance orientation, with fields that are more likely to value brilliance for success at the top, and fields that are less likely to do so toward the bottom. Each arc between two different fields indicates academics moving between those two fields. The color of an arc indicates the extent to which people moving between those two fields is more male tilted or female tilted relative to the distribution of the source field. So the more blue an arc is, the more men are transitioning between those two fields relative to expectations. And the more red an arc is, the more women are transitioning between those two fields relative to expectations. And the last important bit here is that there are upstream transitions, so transitions from lower fab fields to higher fab fields, and downstream transitions from higher fab fields to lower fab fields. The upstream transitions are on the left-hand side of the graph, and the downstream transitions are on the right-hand side of the graph. And what you can see here, and hopefully you can see this with the naked eye, I'm not sure how well it's translating on Zoom, but the transition on the right-hand side of the graph are more red than the transitions on the left-hand side of the graph, right? So you can see this with a naked eye. You don't need a statistic, a p-value here, although we have lots of p-values as well that I can share with you. What this means is that in this global data set, right, at career stages ranging from bachelor's degree holders to department heads, men are more likely to move upstream towards fields of value brilliance, and women are more likely to move downstream, consistent with the field-specific ability beliefs hypothesis. It's also important to mention that this hypothesis can be used to analyze not just gender gaps, but also race ethnicity gaps. So we started this work with a strong emphasis on gender. But the more we thought about it and the more we talked to people and presented this work, we realized that the same argument could be applied to understand why some fields are particularly unlikely to graduate and to promote members of racial ethnic minorities, and others do a much better job of that. So for example, if you look at the same variable, field-specific ability beliefs, and you plot the relationship between that variable, and on the y-axis here, you have the proportion of PhDs in a field. Again, these are US data who are African American. African Americans are a minority group in the US that are stereotyped negatively with respect to their intellectual abilities, much like women are relative to men. What you see here is, again, a strong negative relationship, such that the more a field emphasizes brilliance, the fewer African American PhDs were observed in that field. And that relationship holds even when you take education out of the equation here, which is a little bit of an outlier in terms of its African American representation. So it seems like this way of thinking about the diversity of various fields and organizations is somewhat general, in that it doesn't apply just to gender, but also to racial ethnic groups as well, at least racial ethnic groups that are targeted by similar negative stereotypes with respect to their intellectual abilities, much like women are. The work on the imposter phenomenon comes up in the context of trying to understand, for us at least, comes up in the context of trying to understand how it is that these stereotypes about intellectual ability and a field's emphasis on intellectual ability leads fields to be more or less diverse. So there are several mechanisms that could be involved here, and the imposter phenomenon is one of them. Let me walk you through some of the other mechanisms, and we'll end with the imposter phenomenon here. So, for example, one of the lines of work in my lab suggests that a field's emphasis on brilliance, one of the ways in which it lowers the diversity of that field or organization is that it lowers young women's interest. So messages about brilliance undermine young women's interest in pursuing a broad range of educational and professional opportunities, whereas these messages have no effect on men's interest. So this is a series of experimental studies in which we documented this phenomenon. So because they grow up in a culture that tells them they're less capable than men are, women may opt out of fields that are portrayed as being for geniuses. We also have experimental evidence that gatekeepers exhibit bias against women in contexts where intellectual ability is emphasized. So for example, they're less likely to refer or nominate women than men for brilliance requiring positions, right? But importantly, this bias doesn't hold for other types of positions where the requirements don't involve sort of high-level natural intelligence. So these findings suggest that the perception that a field is brilliance-oriented hampers that field's ability to recruit a diverse body and body of students and a diverse workforce. However, there are issues at the retention stage. So it's not sufficient to diversify a field or organization. It's not sufficient to just get people in the door, to get people to apply, to admit people, but they also need to feel included. They need to feel like they're full-fledged members of the organization. And these beliefs about brilliance being required for success also make it less likely for women, as well as qualified members of minority groups to feel like they belong, to be retained in the long term in these fields. And one reason is that beliefs about intellectual ability being required for success create what some researchers have called a masculinity contest culture. So what do we mean by that? So it's kind of like I'm trying to create the context here. So if success depends on showing that you're brilliant, right, then you better not admit that you don't know the answer to a question, right, that looks not so brilliant. You better not seek other people's advice, because that also seems not so brilliant. You better compete with others to show that you're smarter and better than them, right? Because after all, how many brilliant people can there be in one room or one department, right? So this kind of atmosphere where zero-sum competition is common and showing weakness or uncertainty is frowned upon, right? May be both particularly common in fields that value brilliance for the reasons that I articulated, and also maybe particularly detrimental to women's participation in these fields, because women are not typically socialized in our society to behave in these sorts of assertive, agentic ways. So consistent with this possibility, a study that was led by my former postdoc, Andrei Cimpian, suggests, in fact, that fields that are perceived to value brilliance are also perceived to have more of a masculinity contest culture, which is exactly what I've defined as kind of zero-sum, competitive, show no weakness, sort of dog-eat-dog type of atmosphere. So in this sample, we had about 1,300 academics from STEM, social sciences, humanities, as well as we've included some health sciences, medicine fields. And what you can see here is that actually for both women and men, the more they perceive their field to value brilliance, the more they perceived it to exhibit this sort of masculinity contest culture that I've described for you. However, the relationship was particularly strong for women. So for women in particular, the more they perceive their field to value brilliance, the more they also perceived it to exhibit a masculinity contest culture. So they showed a tighter relationship between field-specific ability beliefs and this MCC, masculinity contest culture variable, which may be in part because these cultures feel more foreign to women, less comfortable, and therefore they may be more attuned to them. They may have a lower threshold for detecting them. Regardless of the reason for the difference here, the takeaway is that a field's emphasis on brilliance might work against this diversity by promoting what scholars have called a masculinity contest culture, which might make it more difficult for women to stick around. It might make it more difficult for that field to retain qualified women. And we have other studies where that suggest that the more a field is perceived to exhibit this kind of masculinity contest culture, the lower the women's belonging, the lower the women's interest in pursuing that opportunity in the long term, and so on and so forth. So finally, another mechanism that might work against brilliance-oriented fields retention of qualified women and scholars of color is the fact that potentially they might be more likely to instill feelings of being an imposter, feelings of being a fraud in these members. So this is all of what I said so far is kind of leading to this data on the imposter phenomenon, which for us is a critical element of the mechanism by which stereotypes about brilliance and emphasis on brilliance, which is a structural factor in academia, might lead certain fields and organizations to be less diverse and less comfortable for diverse scholars. So the idea here is that fields that value brilliance might make scholars that are targeted by stereotypes against their brilliance to doubt that they deserve to be there, to doubt that the success that they've earned so far is actually earned. Maybe it's just an accident, and that they'll just be unmasked as frauds in front of their colleagues and students. So if these feelings of being an imposter are persistently and chronically elevated, and women and people of color in fields that emphasize brilliance, they may make it less likely, these feelings may make it less likely for them to succeed in the long term. So here are some of the data that we have on this. So the lead on this project is my current student, soon to be postdoc at Stanford, Melis Muradoglu. We recruited a sample of about 4,600 academics, again, from a variety of fields, STEM, social sciences, humanities, and health sciences as well. And we grouped academics not just by gender, but also by whether they're a member of a group that's underrepresented in US academia versus not. In US academia, both white individuals and individuals of Asian descent are not underrepresented relative to their share of the US population, whereas other minority groups, such as Black, Latino, American Indian are underrepresented. So we divided our participants that way as well. Participants in the study were asked to report both on the extent to which they perceive their field to value brilliance and also on the extent to which they feel like imposters. And we used, to capture the feelings of being an imposter, we used a well-established, well-validated scale from Pauline Clance. The items are things like, I'm afraid people important to me may find out that I'm not as capable as they think I am. You may have filled out some of these items in the survey that you took for today. Another item is, sometimes I'm afraid others will discover how much knowledge or ability I really lack. So people were asked to report on how often they feel this way. So what you see here is, looking at just the comparison of the women's slopes versus the men's slopes, is that in fact, as we predicted, the more a field is perceived to emphasize brilliance, the more women relative to men feel like imposters, feel like frauds, feel like their success is unearned and that they will be unmasked in front of their colleagues and students. If you look at low levels of brilliance emphasis, right, so on the left-hand side of the graph, there's no difference between women and men in terms of their feelings of being an imposter. So this speaks to the power of the context. It's only in context where brilliance is emphasized toward the right-hand side of the graph that you see big differences emerge between women and men, right? And another thing that stands out here, there was a three-way interaction between field-specific ability, beliefs, gender, and racial ethnic group in predicting feelings of being an imposter. By far the strongest slope here is for women of color in academia. So if you look at the slope here, the slope is the strongest of all of these. And somewhat surprisingly, the slope for men of color in academia was not significantly negative. So there's that doesn't differ from zero. So that makes this difference be particularly strong. And in particular, the strong slope for women suggests that, in particular for women of color, the more they perceive their field to value brilliance, the more they feel like imposters, more so than members of other groups, which might speak to the double bind that many women of color find themselves in academia, where they're stereotyped by others, not just with respect to their gender, but also with respect to their racial ethnic membership. One other bit of data that I wanted to share from you. So again, we have, this paper is already published, so we have lots of robustness checks, like we find this result even when adjusting for the proportion of women and members of minority groups in a field and so on and so forth. I'm happy to talk more about some of the robustness checks we have here. One other thing that I thought the audience might be interested in is that we find a similar interaction between field-specific ability beliefs, predicting imposter feelings as a function of career stage, right? So before we were looking at the interaction between field-specific ability beliefs and gender and race ethnicity predicting imposter feelings. What I'm showing you in this graph is the interaction between field-specific ability beliefs, field brilliance orientation, I'm using those interchangeably, and career stage. So you can see that there's a positive significant slope for more junior members of a field. So for more junior members of a field, the more they feel like their field values brilliance, the more they're likely to feel like imposters. Whereas for faculty members, you don't see the same. In fact, the line is completely flat, right? So there's multiple ways of interpreting that. This is a correlational study, so we can't, we don't really know where the causation truly lies. But at least descriptively, it's sort of a very compelling image of a phenomenon that's more likely to affect younger rather than more senior members of a field in particular contexts, especially in contexts where brilliance is emphasized. I'm not going to have time to go too much into this, but just know that we have some work looking at the developmental roots of this phenomenon, right? So I am a developmental psychologist, at least in part. I identified as a developmental psychologist. So one of the things I was interested in is trying to understand what the history of some of these beliefs that we're studying in adults is. When do these beliefs emerge? What is their developmental course? This is also important for purposes of knowing when to intervene. If you're trying to talk to graduate students and convince them that certain beliefs that they have are not correct, if they've had those beliefs for 10, 15 years, that may be a tall order. It may be difficult to dislodge those beliefs. Whereas if you intervene at the developmental stage at which these beliefs are first acquired, the intervention is more likely to be successful. At least that's one perspective on things. And just one bit of data to show you, one thing that we found is that, in fact, some of the stereotypes that associate high-level intellectual ability with men more so than women, with boys more so than girls, emerge sort of heartbreakingly early, by some accounts at the age of 6. So these are the data that I'll show you here come from a very simple study in which we told children about people that, so these studies are conducted one-on-one. There's an experimenter and a child, and the experimenter tells the child a story about a person at the place that they work that's very, very smart. And importantly, the experimenter never reveals anything about the gender of this person. And then the child is simply asked to guess from a set of pictures of people that they don't know who the person in the story is, the person that's really, really smart, right? So we keep track of how often they choose members of their own group versus members of the other gender group as being really, really smart. And what you see is that at the age of 5, there's no difference between boys and girls in terms of how often they choose members of their own gender as being really, really smart. So girls about 70% of the time, and boys about 70% of the time choose members of their own gender as being really, really smart. However, already at the age of 6, you see differences such that girls are significantly less likely than younger girls, and also than boys of the same age to report that members of their own gender are really, really smart. So one way of interpreting these data is that you see actually evidence of the stereotype that you saw the consequences of in adults at an age as young as 6 and 7. Anyway, so these are data from a particular location in the US, but we have data from other locations in the US as well as from other countries. For example, we have data from Singapore that suggests sort of similar stereotypes being acquired early in children from multiple places in the world. Okay, so last bit here is like, what do we do in light of all this, right? So what do we do with all this data? We haven't actually done the careful intervention work to know what works and what doesn't. But let me speculate for a second in case, you know, some of you are probably here because you're looking to affect positive change. You're looking to do something about this as leaders of a lab, for example, or leaders of a department. So in principle, in light of the argument that I've made here, you could intervene on two things. You can intervene on the stereotypes, right? So you can start calling everyone in your lab brilliant and try to convince them that there's no difference in the brilliance of women and men. Or you can intervene on the beliefs about what's required for success component. You can start talking differently about what's required for success in the field, about what you see as important for success. Now, I personally, in light of the evidence that I've seen, I think that trying to intervene on the stereotype component is quite difficult. We know that, well, stereotypes are very difficult to change. You might, for example, when you try to bring people into the lab and convince them otherwise of a stereotype, at the end of a session, you might see that the stereotype's gone away. But if you bring them back a week later, the stereotype is back where it used to be because they're out in the world and the world is going to reinforce the stereotype no matter what you tell them in the context of your session or what you tell them in the context of lab meeting and so on. Also, telling everyone that they're brilliant while sort of potentially evening the playing field by gender and race ethnicity locally in you know, like even if you don't know how long that'll last, also makes it just more, it's a more challenging context if everyone believes that it's only brilliant people who succeed, right? Because if you start labeling everyone as brilliant, they'll start inferring that, you know, that's what you need to be successful. And that we know from a lot of work is sort of a challenging place to be because every failure can be seen as a reflection on your brilliance, and therefore every failure is more personally affecting, right? So for those reasons, I think it's probably, at least in the short term, more efficacious to intervene on how we talk about success in our context, in our field, in our lab, in our department. So to the extent that we can change the messages that are sent to students and younger people in our field about what's required for success to sort of de-emphasize these traits of brilliance, genius, giftedness, and instead reinforce the factors that people can control about their performance in the field, the vast amount of improvement that can be achieved with the right mentoring, the right strategies, with the right amount of effort. I think these sorts of strategies are much more likely to affect positive change in terms of diversity and inclusion in the short term. And hopefully, if we can manage to change the diversity of the context that we find ourselves in, the stereotypes will follow suit in the long term. So I'm going to stop here and thank you all for your attention. And I'm happy to take questions now or at the end, depending on how we're doing on time.
Thank you very much, Andrei, for this great talk. We have a lot of things to think about now. I will just address 2 questions, and then we can keep the rest of the questions for later. So we have a question from Roland that says, why are the fields like medicine and law not included in the plots, in all the plots that you showed?
Yeah, so medicine was included in some of the later studies. In our first study, we decided to focus on sort of the traditional arts and sciences disciplines because, you know, we needed to start somewhere. This was the first study that was done on this topic. So it wasn't a fully sort of reasoned decision. It was more of a logistical decision. At that time, we didn't have funding for this work. So we kind of like doing this, you know, on our own dime. So we couldn't do a fully comprehensive survey of everyone in academia. So we decided to focus on sort of traditional arts and science fields. but for no good theoretical reason. It's not that we think that these processes are likely to work particularly strongly in this set of disciplines as opposed to this other set of disciplines, as also revealed by the fact that when you include the medical fields and health sciences in research, the same patterns show up.
Mm-hmm. And then one more question that I will go for, and we keep the rest for after, from Karin. What happens between 5 and 6 years old? Where do you assume the differences come from? A school, and what is known about puberty and stereotypes then?
Yeah, so that's a great question. At this point, we don't have a definitive answer to that question, but there are a couple of things I think that are relevant. So between 5 and 6 is essentially the transition between a time when some kids are in school, but most of them aren't, to a time when everyone is in school. And the transition to school is likely to matter here for a number of reasons. First, we know that parents have these stereotypes, but parents may not really have an opportunity to express them when the child doesn't go to school or goes to preschool, where there aren't a lot of intellectually challenging activities, right? So when you're playing in the sandpit or at the water table or you're doing music, there isn't an opportunity for a parent to kind of express their stereotypes about intellectual ability. But once you start going to school and you get homework, and sometimes you do badly on your homework, then beliefs that parents may have had may come out and influence how children think about their own, as well as boys versus girls relative levels of intellectual ability. And we know from work that I haven't shown you that there is in fact a correlation between parents and children's stereotypes. And that correlation is particularly strong among younger children rather than among older children. So when you go up to 11, 12-year-olds, when children's beliefs are much less likely to be shaped by their parents and more by their, the broader culture that they're part of, the correlation between parents and children's beliefs with respect to these stereotypes weakens. Another important thing that happens when children start going to school is that they're exposed to teachers and peers who may also be vehicles for these stereotypes. We know from other work, so for example, from some other work that my husband does, he's also an academic, we know that teachers believe that girls succeed in school by virtue of working hard and they get good grades, but it's not that they're particularly intellectually gifted. Whereas boys have more natural intellectual ability, but because they don't apply themselves, often they don't get as good, their grades are not as good as girls, right? So this is not reality. This is what teachers believe explains the relative performance of girls and boys in the classroom. And we know that kids are very sensitive to what people around them think. So if teachers are going to signal these beliefs, even in subtle ways, kids are going to pick up on it, and they're going to start sort of absorbing some of these stereotypes that portray boys more so than girls, men more so than women, as being particularly intellectually gifted, even if in school maybe they don't apply themselves enough to have their sort of inner genius manifest.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you very much for the great answers. There are very nice questions in the chat. Still one very nice from Carmen. I will continue with the presentation and start the question session with the rest of the questions.
Great.
So maybe thank you, Andrei. I will just go very briefly on my own presentation, but let me just share the screen. Voila. Okay. So thank you very much for participating in this webinar, and it was a pleasure to be already part of the team that prepared this. So I'll give you for 5 minutes my personal opinion, personal journey, how I felt these feelings, let's say, and then briefly show you also the results of the survey so we can open the floor for the discussion. So about the early days, so at school and high school, I don't remember tagging any of my thoughts as imposter feelings because I didn't know that this existed even. I just remember my classmates telling me, but you said you did really badly in this exam, and in fact you have an excellent grade. So are you too modest? Are you too shy? What's your problem? And I genuinely thought that I did badly. So I think that was my first perception of feeling that I was an imposter already. But let's go to 1999 that I entered the university. And in fact, I studied the philosophy of science. So I was very excited because as an adolescent, I really liked this book. The title is in Greek, but it's Sophie's World by Jostein Gaarder, a Norwegian writer. And it's a novel, it's a story, but has some elements of philosophy of science and history of philosophy. So I was very excited to be part of this program at the University of Athens, going to several sciences like astronomy, mathematics, knowing the principles, and then the philosophy of these sciences. But as you can guess, when we had the chapters about neuroscience or the courses about neuroscience won me over. So I really loved studying the brain. I really wanted to go deeper into that discipline. So I had to do something about that. So what I did, I entered a program, a master program in basic and applied cognitive science at the University of Athens, not only because I would learn more about the brain, but because I knew there would be a possibility if they accept me to do a thesis in a lab. So actual experimental work, that it was really what I wanted. So in fact, when I entered the lab, I succeeded in entering for the thesis there, and they gave me a slice with neurons to observe under the microscope. I remember I felt really overwhelmed by this sense of happiness and excitement that this is my dream, and what did I do to deserve this privileged position? However, despite these feelings, I managed to graduate with honors from the master's degree. And I had throughout the feeling of, yes, am I good enough for this? But at the same time, some confidence bouts that really rescued me for my next steps. So I decided to apply for a PhD in neuroscience at the EPFL in Lausanne, where in fact I did my thesis on behavioral neuroscience, and then for a postdoc at the University of Lausanne and then in Geneva, again studying circuit and behavioral neuroscience. So my career was going very well, and my environment, my direct environment, very, very supportive. Throughout these steps, I always had this lurking feeling, am I good enough for this? And this was fueled, at least in my primitive view, like in my view before hearing all these things that Andrei talked to us about, is that was my dream. So how was I so privileged to be in this job? And also because my background was not biology. So I had to struggle more with basic concepts and read more to understand them, although my environment was very supportive of that. Like they really emphasized the need for interdisciplinarity in neuroscience. So I never felt that they didn't like my background or anything. It was me. I felt it was me. After Andrei's talk, I have to reconsider how society has built up at the early age as well. But so how is going today? Fast forward to today, I think it's going better overall. And the reasons why I'm going to briefly mention in this slide. So basically, I think growing older personally helped me a lot to gain perspective and confidence about some things, and really reflect on the fact that since I've been doing that for 10, 12 years, I must be doing something correctly. And the second thing that helped me a lot is becoming a parent. So this is counterintuitive in the beginning, if we think about it, because in the beginning, I couldn't have the time I wanted to work on my research as before, because first of all, my mind was occupied and my priorities were different. So if your kids are sick, which is actually the case 80% of the time in the beginning, maybe, your mind is there, you care more about that. But in the long run, this helped me a lot because I realized that I can propel myself further. If I want to be a happy parent, I have to be happy at my workplace. And if research is what makes me happy, I have to give my everything and my best to be able to continue to do this job, for example. Then the other thing that helped me a lot is throughout this journey, my mentors, professors, supervisors, and colleagues were very, very supportive. So this is for me number one. I mean, I was privileged to be with people that understand me and support me along the way. And of course, with my partner at home. But what would be my action plan? What was my action plan through the year? So basically, I really believed that building a network that believed in me helped me a lot, that also I could discuss my fears and worries with people that I trust. Then this romantic notion that has always been my mantra, that you have to go for your dreams and don't give up. I really believe in that. And when things became a little bit difficult in terms of imposter thoughts, I always said, let's think about it later and focus on the task at hand. And this has really helped me to go through it. Then the final thing, to also give the hint for the discussion, always to push myself to ask questions after the talks, because I think this imposter feeling makes us feel that we need to know everything about a field before asking questions. And this is not the case, this is not true, so I'm still working on it, but I think it's important to build the confidence on that. And so with this, I will emphasize that the first two factors, working in social neuroscience for many years, I really want to emphasize the role of social support in protecting and buffering our mental health. Finally, just going to the survey results, we had 133 responses, and thank you very much all for doing it. 69% were women, 28% were men, 3% non-binary. And then we had several stages of the career. We had the equal proportion of professor and postdoctoral fellows, around 27%. 23% were the graduate students, 14% were research or staff scientists, 4% were department heads, and 7% other categories. So instead of going through the questions one by one, I'm sorry, I cannot share my, I will show you I will highlight one question per set, per 4 slides that I have. In this set, I will highlight the first one. So here we see, I can give the impression that I'm more competent than I really am. And here we can see that there is 43% that replied often, sometimes, 27% often, and 8% very true. So we see that overall, at least sometimes, if we take from sometimes on and onwards, many of us feel that we can give this impression. Here in this set of questions, I want to emphasize the number 7. I often compare my ability to those around me, and think that they may be more intelligent than I am. And here we see it's quite impressive. We have 35% that believe this is very true, and 30% this is often. So 65% of us function with this strategy. We think that we are not as intelligent as the others. And then in the third set, I want to emphasize here the society, because it was brought up a lot in this webinar, and I think it's very important to acknowledge it. Indeed, in this question, society promotes a culture of self-confidence and perfection. We have 44% of the answers being often, and 33% very true. So these together, they make 77%. So it's a whopping percent that's showing that we acknowledge the role of the society indeed in shaping these thoughts. Finally, I want to finish with this set of questions where I will highlight number 16. I consider early retirement from my present position. And here, although we see that there is a hopeful message that 41% of us say that this is not true, so they don't consider early retirement. If we sum up the sometimes, often, and very true, there's still a significant proportion of people that consider this to be the case, that have thought about that. So I think that we are very interested in this question, and we are planning also to a bit dissect depending on the career stage. But overall, I think the results of the survey are very interesting, and I can now stop to speak myself. And thank you a lot for your attention. And we start our interesting part of discussion. So I will just make sure I go to the chat. So I will start by asking you in the panel and every one of us, Carmen's question that I think is addressed to Andrei. The first one, do you have any results on how much talking about imposter syndrome helps individuals overcoming this feeling? So the fact of speaking about it and talking about it, if it's important to alleviate some of these feelings.
I've been thinking about Carmen's question since I saw it in the chat. I personally don't know of any data that speaks to this directly, but I know of data in the stereotype thread, which is a stereotype thread of this phenomenon whereby members of groups that are targeted by negative stereotypes in performance situations, but also in everyday life, the fact that they're always considering how others are evaluating them in light of these stereotypes takes a toll on their well-being, and also in performance situations like exams on their performance. And there's a paper I included in the chat here that essentially asks, what if you tell people that stereotype threat is a thing, so that they can, when they're feeling anxious in test situations, they can attribute their anxiety not to their own shortcomings, but rather to this phenomenon that everyone goes through where they're worried about how they're perceived by others. And that paper suggests that that actually helps, sort of when you're feeling anxious in a test situation, attributing that to this phenomenon that's well established, that doesn't have anything to do with you, that everyone goes through when they're a member of a stereotype group, actually helps improve the performance, because you realize that it's not really anything having to do with you and how good you are at math or whatever is being evaluated, but rather just something that is normal for you to experience in this context, given the stereotypes that others may have about you. So I think we can, with some degree of tentativeness, sort of extrapolate from that to the imposter phenomenon and conclude potentially, or suggest that in the same way, talking to people that telling them that imposter phenomenon is a common thing that lots of people go through. It's not something that has to do with their own vulnerabilities or insecurities, but it's just a normal thing that a human experiences in certain contexts. Then that could sort of take the bite out of the imposter phenomenon. It could make it less like a signal that you don't belong here, that you shouldn't pursue this, but more a signal that you need to sort of like find a context that's more supportive, or steel yourself against these beliefs that might make you feel this way. Just one thing, I mean, one slight potential downside to consider is that if people weren't experiencing these phenomena, these sort of feelings, and now you're putting this on their radar, then it might actually make some people feel or worry about whether they're going to experience this that wouldn't have experienced it otherwise, right? So I think it's important to kind of think about how to balance that. You want to inform people about a phenomenon that's negative that might affect all of them, but those that aren't affected might now potentially start worrying about whether they're going to be affected by it. So you want to think about how to navigate that potential downside that I don't think is worth not talking about it, but it's worth keeping in mind nevertheless.
Mm-hmm. And also just to mention that, for example, it could be that you speak about it with people that are not even in science or in a field that are just your friends, or in another context, that also may help if you trust these people, because this way you have another perspective and they give you also another view. For me, it's always helpful to discuss, of course, with the thought that you're not going to make them also feel doubtful about themselves, but it can really help sometimes, I guess. And also, you have to somehow, I think, understand which people are not helping you, let's say, because they're making you feel worse, or they make you feel not confident. In that case, you have to be early to isolate these feelings, I guess, because it can harm you even if you don't realize, I think. So we have a lot of questions. So I go. Again, it's for Andrei because it's about his talk, and then I will address the newest ones later. What about, does this relate to what you said about with Caroline Beck, fixed versus growth mindset, concluding that success is based on hard work?
So a couple of things here. So yes, these beliefs are related. So insofar as brilliance is seen as a requirement for success, and brilliance is seen as something that you either have or don't have, something that's stable about you that you're born with, then the kinds of things that Carol Dweck has talked about are relevant here as well. And some of the negative consequences of these beliefs could come about via thinking that you need to have this fixed thing and you're always worried about whether you have it or not. And as a woman or as a member of an ethnic minority group, you're more likely to be worried about it, and others are more likely to not perceive you as having it. This is actually an active area of research to actually chart to what extent these beliefs are overlapping versus distinct. There is when measured simultaneously, brilliance beliefs and fixed mindsets are correlated, but not to the extent that you would think that they're the same thing. But I don't doubt that they're related insofar as brilliance beliefs are, at least in this cultural context, usually about something that's fixed, right? That's perceived to be fixed, I should say, not that it's fixed in the world. We don't know how the world works really with respect to this. It's believed to be fixed. I should also clarify that Carol Dweck's argument is not that success is a function of hard work. In fact, she's actually been saying over and over again that this is not how people should interpret her view. And it's an important thing. I mean, I wouldn't make this clarification if it wasn't important. Her view really is that a growth mindset is about the malleability of ability, right? So a growth mindset is essentially that a belief that you can grow your ability. Effort is one way to grow your ability, but effort may not be sufficient. It doesn't matter how much effort you put in. If you're in an environment that doesn't support your effort, then you're not going to grow your ability. So it's really about a combination of things, whatever it takes to grow your ability, and a growth mindset is just a belief that that can happen, right? So it's not equating success with effort. It's essentially portraying ability as something that can be changed, and that has many positive consequences for students and anyone in a sort of an achievement situation, because it really puts you in the driver's seat. It gives you a sense that you can do something about your ability, and one of those things that you can do is to apply more effort, but also you can ask people for how they've succeeded and learn from their strategies. You can ask for extra resources from your department or from your mentors and so on and so forth. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much. We have one more from Jose. Philosophy and mathematics seem having the highest emphasis on brilliance. Does the definition of brilliance in these two fields have specific differences from other fields that have less emphasis on brilliance? So what's the definition? Do you know anything about the definition between the disciplines?
Yeah, so as I mentioned in my talk, really what we're operating with is this intuitive notion of there's a special something that some people have that enables them to succeed. And it's very well possible that, even between philosophy and mathematics, they're thinking of slightly different things when they're imagining the special something, right? I mean, think about music theory and composition as well. Whatever that special something is could be conceived to be a little bit different than what it's like in mathematics. However, the important thing is that at least in academic contexts, it's men who are perceived to have that special something, regardless if it's like a musical special something or a mathematical special something or a philosophical special something. And that has to do with the broader association between really high level intellectual ability and men. Does that help, Jose?
Yes, thank you. But do you think that the differences could induce a higher correlations between, right, imposter syndrome and the brilliance? I was just wondering, right? So for us in our academic environments, it's so important to detect these admissions committees, search committees, etc., where we are, and everybody, members, we need to really know what brilliance is when we are requiring.
Yeah, I think the solution to this problem is probably to move away from trying to evaluate people on brilliance, because nobody really knows what they're talking about, even if they say they do, when they're talking about brilliance, and really ahead of time have very strict, I mean, strict in terms of sticking to them, criteria about what you're going to use to evaluate candidates, whether it's PhD candidates or candidates for an assistant professor position and so on. So it's been shown in many contexts that if you don't have criteria ahead of time, and it's much more likely for biases to sneak in, and then you kind of like start operating on the basis of who you perceive to be brilliant, if this is the kind of thing that you're looking for your lab or for your department. But if ahead of time you say, I'll give 20% to, like number of publications, 20% to whatever impact factor, I'm not saying that these are the criteria we should use, but whatever, like if you're very clear about the concrete criteria you're going to use, then there's less room for these sorts of noxious beliefs that we're talking about to sneak back in.
So just a brief question from Karen about the surveys. Says question about the categories, why mixing not all, not at all, very true with rarely, sometimes often, different categories. So first of all, for the survey, yeah, I really have to thank also Matilde for putting everything together and sending us the data. I didn't mix anything like in real numbers, but for me, when we say sometimes, it means we have already a positive answer. It has crossed our mind, so it just helped me to interpret the data by sometimes grouping it with often or very true and often. So for me, it's like a positive, sometimes contain a positive element, but of course that's why I didn't really group them or add them, because they have the value on their own as categories. We will try to work more on the survey in the future. I think there is a question from Carmen. Carmen, do you want to ask it? Because you say another question. I don't know who wants to ask questions directly live or...
Sorry, yeah, I'm here. I don't have a microphone. Probably, I don't know if you hear me well.
Yes,
No,
it's fine.
yes. No, I was wondering indeed to what extent the imposter syndrome, when it's acknowledged, if we talk more about it, I think it might be good. But for those that acknowledge it, if it influences the effort component that was discussed before also. Because indeed, if somebody doesn't feel that belongs, that means perhaps that doesn't feel also that can make it. And then there is the danger that this reverts in not being put in the effort that is required. So I think all these efforts like this webinar and talking and trying to understand what can really help people can be critical in order to get out of this hole somehow. So, but yeah, I was wondering if there is any comment on this, the interaction with effort.
I would like to bring in something that I feel it's relevant to what you just asked, Carmen, and also to what Stamatina has been talking about social buffering and the feeling of connectiveness. And I think it's also the way we talk about things and the way we talk about the imposter syndrome. And I would like to bring in the concept of self-compassion versus self-esteem. And I think it's if we focus on self-compassion, that we are all humans, that the human condition is imperfect, that we all make mistakes, we all can have feelings like that and be open about it, and especially at the level of the ones that are in the higher ranking, if they come out admitting as mentors that yeah, we have made mistakes, yeah, you don't have to be perfect, you don't have to be the most brilliant one to make it, then I think more and more people will feel that they want to put the effort because it's going to go somewhere. And this notion of self-compassion, although it's relatively new in the psychology field, it has already shown that it can be positively associated with the growth mindset that we talked about, and proactivity, higher motivation, greater resilience. And actually there was a paper I think I posted in the resources, and I can bring it up there, that is also associated with our counter working on the imposter feelings directly if we cultivate this self-compassion.
Thank you, Natasha. I don't know if Jose or Andrei have comment on the effort aspects.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if it's going to go beyond what Natasha said, but I think it's really important. So there's there are many ways of talking about one's feelings of being an imposter. Some are more helpful and others are less helpful. I think the goal in getting people to share their feelings is to normalize this, because the danger in not talking about it is thinking that you are weird, that, you know, even though you've been given all these opportunities, you have these feelings and this is something about you, right? And that's not right. And that can very much undermine your willingness to put in effort and to kind of like stick around and try to make the most of the opportunities that you've been given. But to the extent that you realize that lots of people are affected, that this is a normal thing that affects some people in some contexts, I think, you know, like if that's the tone of the discussion, if that's the takeaway that the discussion is guided toward, that can be an empowering thing. This is not me. I'm not weird. There's nothing wrong with me. This is just a normal thing that people, humans, experience in particular contexts. And therefore, when I see challenges in front of me, you know, tomorrow or the next week, I shouldn't sort of undermine myself with these feelings. If I feel them, I'm just going to attribute them to what they are, which is just a normal reaction to a challenging environment, right? So it's really important to kind of, if you have a discussion about this with mentees, to kind of have this particular framing on it of normalizing something that otherwise, when hidden, may be seen as sort of like an individual pathology.
Thank you very much. We can have one or two more questions. Is there somebody that wants to ask live or even through the chat more? I want to ask something. We have something in the chat I saw. Yes. I wanted to ask something, Andrei, about your graph about the faculty that had no correlation and it was quite flat, the line. That was impressive for me, because in our survey, that is in a small sample, we had 27% professors and they all seem to reflect some of this feeling. Did you try to stratify based on if they were tenure track already or at what stage of the faculty career they were?
Yeah, we have that information as well, and it's in the paper. So if you're interested, it's in the paper itself that these data come from. I think generally, and we also have the information about the PhD students. Are you in years 1 to 3 or 4, 5, 6, right? And generally, what we saw, if I remember correctly, is that there's a fairly linear sort of progression where, you know, like the younger you are, the more likely you are to experience these feelings, whether you're a PhD student or a faculty member. And then the interesting question is like why that is. Is it a selection thing? Like if you experience as a young person high levels of this, you just opt out, and then who's left in the sample is only the people who don't have these feelings? Or is it a sort of like it gets better story where initially everything is new and you don't know what's happening? So it's kind of like, you know, it's normal to feel high levels of being an imposter, but as you stick around in the field, you kind of like come to sort of realize that you have a fair amount of ability, and these feelings kind of like go by the wayside. And that's a more hopeful story. And I hope that at least part of what we're seeing in the data by career stage is a function of that. But it's at this point, we don't really know how much is selection. The people that had high levels as young sort of members of the field have just dropped out, and how much of it is an it gets better sort of story. And let me also say, so the flat slope, was in fact flat as a function of field-specific ability beliefs, like as a function of brilliance orientation, but it wasn't like at floor, right? So the slope was flat at a level of like 3, if I remember correctly, 3 out of 7, which is not a trivial amount of feeling like an imposter. So yeah, so these feelings don't totally go away, even for more senior members of the field.
Yes. And then another thing I want to mention very briefly, because it came up to the breakout room during the ALBA General Assembly, is that, yes, what we can do about it, because as a team, we are thinking what would be next actions. Maybe you can give us feedback in the audience about that later with email. Because a lot of things were said about having a mentor that can help you out of these feelings. And we discussed it during the breakout room, and could be a nice thing to think how the system, as Andrei, you mentioned at the end, how we can start changing is maybe also to change the way the system is, and it's a good point to give some instructions for mentors or some strategies that would help alleviate some of these feelings.
I agree. The more the messages come from the top, from very senior members of the field, I think the more effective they are, because they set the norm for the field, right? Like if people who are in positions of power start talking like this, I too experience these feelings, I encounter difficulties, you too can make it through. I think that kind of normalizes these feelings much more powerfully than if you hear from your friends at the same career stage that they're going through these feelings. So.
Exactly, and Karen also makes a comment that it's a leadership responsibility, yeah. So I think, yeah. So with this, I don't know if, we have one comment from Simone. Many funding agencies base their funding programs on promoting excellence. Shouldn't this also be reconsidered, rather support science and ideas if we want to avoid funding scientists with imposter syndrome? Yeah, I think it's a very important point indeed, as Natascha wrote. Natascha, you want to comment?
Yes, it was just when I saw it, it was me trying to find funding over the years, and because I did very long postdoc, and then I was realizing I ran out of so many funding bodies. And then you have the women oriented, but they are women in excellence, so this never goes without the other. And I was feeling I'm cut out of so many things if you don't fulfill some, as Andrei I think implied, some kind of random excellence criteria that no one really knows what they are, apart from, I don't know, having 5 cell papers and 3 science, that anyone would get the award with this, and anyone would get the funding, and anyone would get anything. So I that's why I think this point is really relevant. And I would like to hear something from someone more senior, or someone that deciding on these awards and this funding, what their view is on that. And Andres, of course.
What I can say as not a senior, but somebody that is in the same stage, let's say, I think it depends really on the definition of excellence. They can never stop to say something to this, there has to be some criteria somewhere. But I agree, it has not to be on the traditional excellence sense, but also science and ideas. And I think in Switzerland, I think at least the SFN is moving towards the direction of really not only looking impact factors, for example, but other very important things in your career. So I think many countries are moving towards this direction, and I hope it's more and more. That's my comment at this stage. I don't know for more senior people, and depending on the country, how are things?
Yeah, I think it's going to be hard to move away from. Obviously, there's always going to be a small amount of money that a lot of people apply for. So to some extent, excellence is going to be something that people are looking for, regardless of whether it's explicitly articulated or not. So I think the important thing is to be very specific in what you mean by excellence, as opposed to kind of like leaving it up to people to imagine excellence however they will, right? So I think this is kind of comes back to something Natascha said in Stamatina as well. Like if there's a very specific set of criteria, okay, we're looking for excellence. Obviously, that's a competition, so only some people will be funded as a function of this. But here's what we mean by excellence. To the extent that that can be sort of cashed out in very specific terms, then that will help. I mean, I guess there's another element of, even if just the use of the word itself might be a turnoff, might make some people who would have applied for these opportunities not apply for them because they don't feel they meet this criteria. And then that's an important consideration that goes above and beyond whether the criteria is specific. Even if the criteria are very, very specific, if you still use the word excellence very prominently, it's possible that you won't get as diverse a sample of applicants as you would have otherwise. So there's also that element to be considered here.
Yeah, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are 8 minutes over time, and I think we need to close this session. If nobody has anything else to say from the panel, I would like to thank all of you for participating, and all of the panel of the speakers, and also Matilde for and all the ALBA team for the organization. So thank you very much. It was great. I would stay here 1 more hour to discuss, but unfortunately we close now, and we hope we see you in France, that we have similar events relevant.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
You're welcome.